right, how are you guys? Yeah, great. A lot of enthusiasm at 8:45, not my usual speaking time. All right, so I am Will Reilly. Thanks to Jake for introducing me. And he already told you most of what you need to know about me. It's good to be here. I see a lot of people whom I've interacted with across a whole variety of arenas here in the room today. And I hope I don't disappoint. I'm giving more of a talk than a PowerPoint presentation. So my background image is literally just the front cover of my book on taboos and censorship and the front page of Corey Clark's excellent paper on the same topic. Originally, these were going to be sort of in rotation, but apparently they're just up there together, which is also fine. You should definitely check out both of them. But the theme of my presentation is really what I feel that the core taboos in academia and kind of in upper middle class society more broadly are, and what they mean, as illustrated by some data and also by some case studies. So I'm going to be talking about some people that I've, in most cases, interacted with personally around these topics, like Roland Fryer at Harvard. And I will talk about some of my own writing while I do this. Obviously, I did write Taboo. And being the, I believe, 14th author of this paper rather than the first, I don't feel as constrained as Corey or Lee Jussum or some others in the room have been, Musa, good to see you, about discussing this piece of writing. But so in 2020, I wrote a book based around the idea of third rail topics that you just can't talk about across the sectors that I just mentioned, which was based on a couple of, I think, pretty good data sets and also on just obvious social trends at the time. And the first of these taboo topics was oppression, or rather, in my opinion, the almost total lack of it in the modern United States. So specifically, the focus of the first chapter was that United States police are not out in the streets massacring black people. And it's important to remember that this was the very core claim of the Black Lives Matter movement, at least early on. This didn't switch to sort of an intelligent conversation about disproportions in policing for some years. Just like to break from the speech, the conversation about the gender pay gap didn't switch to, well, expectations that women stay home with children are to some extent sexist themselves, which my fiance would probably agree with. That we didn't get there for decades. The original claim was just that women make 69 to 83 cents as much as men do for the exact same work, which is, of course, nonsense, but I mean, the front fort was held for as long as possible. I mean, in this case, Cherno Biko, one of BLM's primary organizers, went on primetime Fox News and claimed that an innocent, unarmed black man is, in his words, murdered by the police pretty much every day. Ben Crump, who's actually an entertaining guy if you talk to him with the camera off, but super lawyer Ben Crump went a little further. He wrote a book called Open Season, The Legal Genocide of Colored People in the United States. And my understanding, I don't want to misquote him, but adding up his figures across police, vigilante violence, so on, he seems to feel that tens of thousands of innocent black men are murdered by white armed authorities annually. And people sort of believed this crap, is the phrase that comes to mind. So the Skeptic Research Center in 2021 found that among the standard, very liberal 1/5 of the data set, not communists or socialists, but anyone to the left of center left, among that block, the average person believed that between 1,000 and 10,000 unarmed black men alone were killed by the police every year. So, to take a break for a second, once again, there are about 20,000 murders total in a year in the United States. So the second chapter of the book, Taboo, focused on interracial crime. And again, I'm going to reply to this narrative in this speech, and I did in the book, but you had a very specific sort of party line here. And almost all mainstream citizens statistically agreed that you couldn't safely disagree with it in public. So the narrative was that ethnic conflict was basically out of control and white people were responsible for most of it. Remember Barbecue Becky? You know, virtually every week we'd see another essentially random citizen made famous for getting into an argument or kind of a broken nose level street fight with an African American person. And I went back through the book and wrote down a couple of these. I mean, we had Permit Patty, Coupon Carl. We had the Central Park dog walker case. This person, all banter aside, actually ended up losing her home and her dogs. The police ended up going to her apartment and reclaiming her dog. You had Sarah Brash at Yale and a dozen others. Karen, a common female name, became a bit of an ethnic slur. Major magazines and even journals ran pieces on topics like the exhaustion of living while black and how to face white violence while a black person. So going on again, chapters 3, 4, and 5 of the book dealt with taboos of possible difference and inferiority. So focusing on differential rates of performance among groups against a variety of metrics. Crime rates again, but also out-of-wedlock birth rates, and most notably recorded differences in things like IQ and test scores, which are one of really the fundamental taboos in American society right now. Most of our taboos are sort of violations of the general blank slate idea that all people are basically the same. That there are no real differences between men and women, probably, the great races, definitely, the social classes, probably, so on down the line. And that brings up the question, so why do people perform differently? And it leaves room for the answer to be oppression. Some devil out there in the matrix is causing these harms to exist. And again, we're going to talk about how plausible that is. But by this point, there's a very set narrative here that is pretty openly described as unchallengeable in several social science literatures. So basically, the claim is what I just said it was: any gap in performance between two large groups has to be due to racism or to some equivalent like sexism. And this is obviously the contention that made, for example, the good Dr. Ibram Kendi, nee Hank Rogers, famous. And he's devoted an entire book. Well, actually, now it's about 7 books, How to Train a Young Anti-Racist and so on. But he's devoted one somewhat academic book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, to the idea that the only possible explanation for gaps in test scoring or arrest rates or presumably anything else are 1, racism, however subtle, and 2, genetic inferiority. As Kendi puts it on, I think, page 12 of How To, the two possibilities are some flaw, quote unquote, in systems. Again, however hard to define this may be, however subtle and imprecise, or alternatively, that there's something just wrong with some people. And so on. I mean, so the things that seem to be really verboten to say for a long period of time were oppression is fading. You break that down into policing, police violence, interracial crime, differences in criminality and conflict, IQ, anything along those lines, anything that sort of challenges the blank slate idea. And I think we're still pretty much seeing variations on that same pattern. But I do go on into a couple other things. I mentioned gender identity briefly. This, by that time, when I turned in the manuscript in maybe 2019, hadn't become sort of the fulcrum point that it is now. But I mention it in the flow of several of the chapters. Like Gad Sad, I ask the question, do some women really have 9-inch penises? And that would be a logical conclusion to draw from the trans argument. And if not, why is it almost forbidden to say so socially? Why not? Raise your hand if you believe that some women do have 9-inch penises. Okay. Fair enough. And thank you. Several people honestly expressed that opinion, and it is an opinion shared by about 35% of the US population. So thank you. This is a forum not for one side, but for unrestricted discourse. All right, I talk about immigration and even quote-unquote eugenics. It would be considered extraordinarily rude to say that we do not want large numbers of very stupid people moving to the United States, and I'm not sure why. But it is my contention that the first 5 core chapters break down the most core taboos, the non-existence of oppression in any real sense, historically comparative, race and policing, interracial crime, ethnicity and IQ, the existence of metrics like IQ themselves, single motherhood, and beyond that sort of family structure, gender roles, is there a human nature, so on. Now, the interesting thing about each and every one of these forbidden topics, and after a very brief note on this, I'm going to get to the case studies, then hopefully to a good number of questions from the audience. But the interesting thing about each and every one of these forbidden topics is that there's a very documentable, usually documented, not really disputed reality that's almost the opposite of what you're supposed to say. And as with yesterday's presentation about why even, sorry, dry throat. As with yesterday's presentation about why even knowledgeable people often don't tell the truth about gender bias in hiring, for example, I think this gets into some pretty deep points about what the actual purpose of censorship is. So when it comes to the presence or absence of oppression in policing, for example, we sometimes do find some biases, but we've known exactly how many unarmed black men are killed by police at some level, at least since the inimitable Heather McDonald's research in the mid-2010s. So when I looked for this book in 2015, I was surprised by the small number of police shootings, at least in the context of a country of 350 million people. That year, there were 1,000 total fatal police shootings, obviously each in its own way a tragedy, but not a massive number. 250 of them involved African Americans in any capacity, and 17 involved unarmed black males who were shot by white officers, 17. This is pretty much the same. We see the same trend every year. By this point, there's an official Washington Post database called The Counted, pretty politically neutral. Last year, there were 12 unarmed black people, this is men and women, shot by the police. You can argue that the black rate of police shooting is disproportionate, so it's about 24% of the pool of people that are victims, might be the word in these cases, as versus 13% of the United States population. But the black crime rate right now, according to the Bureau of Justice statistics, is 2.3 times the white crime rate. If you simply adjust for that one variable, the gap vanishes. The same thing's true for interracial crime. We know what the actual rate is. So the real culprits behind American cross-racial attacks tend not to be upper middle class white women named Karen, who unprovokedly attack young black men and try to steal their bicycles. Looking at figures from 2022 from the same crime report, interracial crime was about, we'll get into this in a second. Interracial crime was about 85% black on white. So there were 543,000, this is probably the one thing I should have had a slide for. There were 543,000 black on white serious or index violent crimes, and there were 97,000 white on black index felonies. Now, to some extent, I will say this just makes sense. There are 5 times as many white people as there are black people in the United States. It's almost exactly 60 to 12, and the white people have more money, a thing a criminal might want. But it's certainly not the narrative of oppression that we hear all damned day. It's worth noting, by the way, in terms of the kind of contrasting narratives of victimization, that in the last year we kept track of this, 2018, there were 50,113 black on Asian crimes. So that's about 28% of the total number of crimes against Asians, as versus 563 Asian on black crimes. So that's a ratio of 89 to 1. In fact, lest anyone else feel superior, everyone, for some reason, picked on Asian Americans. So crime against Asians was 25% Caucasian, 28% Black, 21% Hispanic and Native, and just 24% Asian. The year after this data was released, the federal government stopped keeping track of crime against Asians, by the way. So moving on, without making any excuses, by the way, since my group is performing even more poorly than everyone else in this data, without making any excuses, it's worth noting that the total number of index violent crimes each year is 12 to 20 million. So even if you take 100,000 white serious felonies and 500,000 black serious felonies, those combined are about 3% of crime. So the narrative presented on, for example, X of constant interracial conflict, groups brawling in the street and so on is complete fantasy overall. The secondary point would simply be that the directionality of that is even more fantastic. When those crimes do occur, they occur about 85% of the time in the direction that we're not supposed to notice. But as I often note to civilian audiences, the person most likely to kill you is your wife. Or your husband. I mean, there's a whole joke that goes along with this, like it's your ex-wife, but your current husband, which perhaps gets into male-female personality differences, slightly higher IQ, capable of longer hate. I won't do the whole thing. But at any rate, we know the facts here. Like, we're aware of all of these things. We're aware of all of the things that you're not supposed to say. When I uncovered the Asians data, which might become a short paper, I was genuinely shocked by that. The whole Stop Asian Hate sort of thing that Trump supporters were traveling into cities and beating up Asian Americans or something. The attackers turned out to be almost entirely black guys and working class white guys who lived close to Asian Americans. So there's a huge amount of fiction that we're fed, and you, to some extent, have to wonder how many good tax-paying citizens believe it. It's a real problem. At any rate, same thing with when we get into the IQ data, we know what that is. That there are currently large group gaps in tested IQ. Emphasis on tested isn't really disputed. According to Charles Murray, who looked at pretty much every, whatever you might think of this book on either side of the aisle from the right or the left, he looked at pretty much every full-scale IQ test at every PISA administration over the past, I believe, 22 years, and came up with the average scores: 91 for African Americans, 93 for Hispanics, 102 for Caucasians, and 107 for Asian Americans. So again, we know what those are. If you just add up the last 17 tests, those are the averages that you get. Now, whatever the cause here might be, and I'm going to give my opinion on this, it's obviously not due to racism. The highest scoring groups are Asians, South Asians, and Jewish Americans, who incidentally outscore everybody. It looks like, per some adversarial work between Chanda Chisala and a guy named Fewhurst, like Nigerians and other black immigrants score at least as well as whites do. So that would also be tough for the quote-unquote hereditarian perspective. Black people from Africa seem to be some of the higher performing people in the United States. As of right now, Cameroonians, Kenyans, Ghanaians, Nigerians, and South Africans, although I assume that latter group includes some whites, given the political dynamic in their country, all outperform the national average by a pretty good margin. So my own, as a college professor, my own fairly simple hypothesis would be that the more you study for tests, the better you probably do on them. And that, as Vivek Ramaswamy recently drew an apple-throwing mob for pointing out, white and black American students may not be the hardest book hitters in the world. Remains to be seen. The professors in the room may have an opinion. So, but anyway, examples of the kind of taboos that I'm talking about, I would describe these as sort of bipartite and directional, right? So there's a thing that is true, there's a thing that you're supposed to say, and to some extent, most intelligent citizens are aware of this difference. These aren't hard to find. So in the top-notch paper that makes up part of my hitter, Corey Clark, and I think something like 5 people that are in this room, Lee Jussum is here. Musa, is it Al Garbi? Okay, Musa Al-Garbi's here. A number of other people that are currently present contributed to this. But Clark et al. Break out 10 of these. So the taboos that are tested in this paper include the following. Gender biases are not the primary reasons for the underrepresentation of women in current STEM. Race biases do not explain higher crime rates among U.S. black people. Evolution may have resulted in some noticeable differences between men and women. And it really goes on. I mean, biological sex is binary for the vast majority of people. Who knew? Transgender identity and similar youth social identities in the accompanying literatures can be the product of social influence. The social sciences in the United States, this may be my favorite one, may discriminate against conservatives in hiring grants and invitations to the very best symposia, with, of course, one clear exception. In each case, what the team, I'll presume on my 2-paragraph contribution and say we here, found was that very large chunks of people thought or knew that the thing was true, but at least substantial percentages of them were very reluctant to kind of utter it publicly. So overall, I think that the most stringent modern prohibitions kind of follow this pattern. So I guess this would be the breakdown of core taboos for me. They exist where something is either very plausible or just obviously true. Any person with a brain can see this, but a large block of people have a passionate partisan or religious objection to this being real, to reality being real, would be a good way to put that. So taboos, to some extent, to a very large extent, are true things that you aren't supposed to mention. And this is fascinating because it's a reminder of what the actual historical role of the Catholic or the Hindu censor was, right? It wasn't knocking out dumb, bad ideas or something like that. It was preventing the spread of actual challenges to the throne and the altar and the laws of Manu. Like, the point was that if something was intelligent enough to topple the current system, it had to be eradicated. And a brace of case studies illustrate how this works in the modern world, how order is kept. So as the public reaction of research ones to actual data about policing in the absence of oppression, I would say the clearest case study is almost certainly Roland Fryer. So Fryer, who is the youngest African-American ever to get tenure at Harvard, I think the 5th youngest person, at least in the modern era, looked at police shootings by race back in 2017, and to quote him, he found 2 things. 1, he found what everyone else good did, and 2, he found out. So in the JPE, the Journal of Political Economy, Fryer noted first that there are very few police killings of any kind. And second, as this is by far his main point, that these don't seem to track with racial bias at all, at least per his very large city samples. So he found some potential discrimination in terms of things like officers going hands-on, struggling with suspects. Although, and I want to emphasize this, even that was statistically insignificant and was on the order of 16%. But as shooting and killing, he found no statistical discrimination at all. In fact, even that's not quite correct. Officers were 27.5% more likely to shoot white people and Caucasian Hispanics, whom a cynic might say tend not to draw marches. So when it came to the highest level of police violence, you were actually much more likely to be shot as a white guy. Although to be fair, I don't believe that reached 0.05 statistical significance either. And when this all dropped, my take would be that Harvard did everything but assassinate the good Dr. Fryer. He lost his lab and research team, allegedly for telling sexist jokes 2.3 years earlier. He was almost fired despite tenure. And the whole thing, without making fun of a sad story involving a good guy I know, reads like a medieval or Renaissance farce. The academic executive who targeted the brilliant Fryer was Claudine Gay, who was recently exposed by Chris Rufo for actual full-on plagiarism. shortly after she explained to Congress that she didn't know whether the phrase, quote, "kill the Yahood" was hate speech. This is less known, but it's worth noting that 2 other excellent academic papers on policing, which found the same thing that Fryer did, were mobbed on social media following what looked a lot like organized kind of junior academic slacktivism within 12 to 18 months of this all happening with him. So one of them, from Michigan State researchers Cesario and Johnson, remains the best methodological paper, papers I've contributed to included, that I've seen on this topic. But the authors had to plead for, I think the quote is, "a retraction to review our process," or some such, after weeks of screeching from Twitter clowns. It's impossible to imagine that this did not have a chilling effect. When Bob Moranto, who's in the audience and who is the first author here, wrote our own paper on Black Lives Matter a few years later, we looked at police shooting rates and at which big cities managed to keep them down while also preventing, murders. We found that we were basically the only quantitative paper on point on the movement since 2020, this is the year after this happened with Roland Fryer. Typical papers in this decade, which we're now 5 years into, dealt with things like the decision by the Ben & Jerry's ice cream chain, this is an actual paper you can look up, to name new flavors after specific young revolutionaries. And that probably was exactly, and I drew a couple of potential ideas in the speech of what these could be called, but I'm not going to go through them. But that probably was exactly what the censor wanted. That since the extreme controversy around the 3 serious papers, there was another paper, by the way, that found that, I don't even know if this got out of the working paper stage, but which found that cities which experienced BLM protest activity saw an increase of about 10% in murders. And that, again, that's not really challenged, but for obvious reasons, never made it into kind of the slipstream of general information in the way that the movement's claims themselves did. But so examples of this, examples of the censor effect abund. When we talk about some of these other topics, I mentioned Charles Murray earlier. They throw pies at him when he speaks on campus. But I think that Amy Wax is an even better example of someone who stepped too close to the testing and IQ scores taboo. Now, she's made some genuinely provocative and angry statements as the professional backlash against her intensified. But it's worth remembering what her initial comment was, which began the media controversy and still dominates a little more than 60% of on-the-record coverage of her. Wax simply said that she'd almost never seen an African-American student graduate in the top quarter of the UPenn Law School class, and that most finished in the bottom half. The problem is that that's obviously true, and it's the inevitable result of affirmative action policies, unfortunately. As those of you who have been in business or on the administrative side of academia know, the goal of affirmative action is group proportional representation regardless of performance, which is what equity in practice actually means. So the problem there is that if you take a typical quasi-board test like the SAT, I looked up some of the more recent scores this morning, actually, to add them to the speech. The mean score is 912 for Native Americans, 941 for Black Americans, 987 for Hispanics. It's almost always around 1,100 for whites. It's 1,118 right now. And then 1,243 for Asian Americans. So the breakdowns by group, except that Asians do a bit worse, are pretty much identical on the LSAT. You're gonna see this on almost any test that you look at. So the point is that to get those groups represented on campus at the same rates that they are within the US population, you're going to have to accept gaps that are at least that size on campus. Probably a bit larger for obvious statistical reasons. Not everyone gets accepted. The distribution spreads out at the tails and so on down the line. But the 941 guy is rarely going to be your valedictorian. Again, that's a thing that almost everyone knows, but that it is very impolitic to say. And reactions like this, again, burn the witch, are a very effective enforcement mechanism. I assume they also were against traditional herbal medicine, which is what witchcraft is, because devils don't actually exist, and so you can't talk to them. So, actually, an interesting example of the power of mobbing, this, again, just off the head, but I went to a working class high school just outside Chicago, East Aurora Senior, and we were talking about the witch trials in American history. And the group, it turned very ugly because a group of people started asking, how do you know that those people weren't actually witches? And it was a mostly female group, kind of working class to upper middle. It was really interesting, the dynamic. And someone finally asked the question, like, why wouldn't the government punish them if they thought they were dangerous? And the teacher finally stood up and said, because there's no such thing as witches. And closed the book, and we went on to the next chapter, how we got freedom from Britain. But I mean, I think at some point, someone has to be the person that does that. But the witch hunting instinct is deeply ingrained in man. So, at any rate, reactions like this are a very effective enforcement mechanism. Now, I actually will say a final thing here before some questions. I actually think the risk for academia is something a bit different from what I've heard during the kind of like, can our critically important disciplines be reclaimed conversations so far. As someone who still has a foot in the business world, knows a few people in the Trump administration, tries to keep up on growing alternatives to the R1 model like the University of Austin, New College, the resurgent think tank sector, I actually think there's a real risk of marginalization or perceived absurdity outside of STEM. Within maybe 10 to 15 years, that would be the investment window I would look at. Looking at Harvard or indeed USC, that seems wildly implausible today, but I mean, that's also what people would have said looking at, say, the Maginot Line. Excuse the terrible French pronunciation there. But just as a casual investor, I mean, I noticed that very major companies like Walmart, Twitter, Meta, just cut their entire DEI divisions. This all happened within the past 6 months. Got rid of pretty much all their race and gender stuff. And over the past 4 weeks, seem to be firing pretty much everyone with a soft science degree as useless. Twitter actually very famously cut headcount by 80% and started functioning better. Insurance companies actually seem to be taking even our climate change predictions less seriously. I'm not sure whether the LA fires will affect that a bit. But there's a perception that everything is just partisan nonsense. And when you combine this stuff with the replication and p-hacking crises, you have to wonder what the future is for an expert class that denies that sex and IQ are real while writing about the feminist queerness of Hamas. To quote an actual paper that my fiance has on her desk right now. So you don't see a lot of wizards and alchemists around today because they were replaced by a better alternative. So I guess my closing line would be, in the AI era, let's avoid that for ourselves. I think it's a solid breakdown of what, between these two, the 8, 9 core taboos are in academia. Let's start breaking them. I'm available for questions, assuming anyone has any. Thanks, guys.
All right, thank you, Will. Let's do some questions. I saw your hand shoot up right away.
Sir.
Ben Slivka, retired monopolist. When I think about taboos historically, there was some underlying foundation, like not eating seafood because of the chances of getting ill. And so I wonder if you could contrast that traditional definition of taboo with your new definition.
Yeah, I think that a taboo is, you guys can still hear me, right? Okay, I think that a taboo is, at the simplest level, a taboo is simply a strongly socially forbidden thing. I'm using the definition here today of true thing you are not supposed to do. And I think that's what it means in modern up middle class life. Your point, by the way, you described yourself as a retired monopolist?
I built Internet Explorer 1, 2, 3 at Microsoft,
great.
and we got sued for antitrust because our browser was too good.
Oh, good. I just like the description. I have an uncle that calls himself a flint-hearted encloser of the comments. So there's a whole thing there, actually. One of my relatives who's, and I'm going to answer your question in a second, but one of my relatives who's very hotep, very pro-black, looked up our family background and found out that one of my ancestors was apparently a black slave trader. It just absolutely devastated him. The history of West Africa is actually very interesting. So anyway, but it kind of, I think that a taboo is just one of the two things that we've classified it as. I would agree that historically most taboos had causal reasons, but there's a book called Sick Societies that I'd recommend. I think that in anthropology, there's long been a tendency to look at anything that a group of primitive people do and describe it as adaptive for some reason. I would say that a lot of things like primitive medicine or dietary taboos tend to become, frankly, maladaptive after a generation or two and just stick around. If you actually have ever worked with anthropologists that work with native tribes, and I think Dr. Weiss talked about this on the first day of the conference, a lot of their rules, like women can't enter certain sites because, they sometimes menstruate, seem nonsensical to abusive to most modern people, but they have managed to endure over the years. I think that a lot of the taboos we have today probably have some logical foundation. For example, we're a very diverse society, and most people used to be well-trained with arms. So unless you were very polite to people of different ethnic groups, they might kill you. Now that we have a more established tradition of civil law, I think we can probably relax that a little bit. So I would say that our rules today probably have some logic to them. But I think that we need to assess that logic against other potential sources of benefit and cost. I think that would be the answer.
Yes, Gary Geipel, Missouri State University. I wish I had a better description of myself than that. But I'm curious in what you might share in terms of your experience, especially from teaching, in terms of how to overcome these things. And it seems like traditional persuasion, I mean, you've mustered a demolishing argument, obviously, in terms of the facts, but traditional persuasion seems inadequate to build on your, I think, essential observation that this is more like religion.
Yes.
So is there something on the order of cult deprogramming techniques, or what does one use to break through here in a way that is not in itself career harming and so forth?
Well, I think the last part might be the toughest part to deal with. I mean, how do you do this as an academic without some damage to reputation or career? And that's something you have to figure out at individual institutions. How do you do it? I do think that for a lot of people, simply presenting facts is very useful because they've never heard the facts. So, I mean, when I talk to classes at K-State, they're mostly going to be black and Appalachian men for whatever reason, and political science and business. A lot of them really believe that the American police force is corrupt to third world levels and that 10,000 unarmed men, they wouldn't necessarily just say African American, are shot every year by the police. So when you pull up the Washington Post, which they all recognize as a top paper on the left, I mean, the state college level students, and you show them the actual figures, 100 for all races, 12 for African Americans, I mean, that does change minds. It's also worth remembering that in a debate or in a classroom conversation, you're often talking to the 90% of people that are non-committed. So, I mean, I've had formal debates with people ranging from Jared Taylor, who's the founder of the alt-right, to Rod Graham, who's a far-left sociologist. And both those guys are very skilled debaters. They're not going to change their minds. The question is, what does the House, what does the audience think by the end of the conversations? And I think that the majority of people in a classroom, if someone says something like, hiring in medicine today is extremely discriminatory against minority women, I think the majority of people in the room are going to be pretty open to the idea that that's nonsense, honestly. So if you can demonstrate that, you're talking to the 85 to 90% of the room. And yeah, for the people that are devoted social justice warriors, yeah, it is almost a religious idea, because anything, the core claim is that all people are exactly equal. So all gaps between people must be caused by the external demonic force. So if you disprove the external demonic force at one level, it simply exists at the other level. So, I mean, when we talked about the pay gap issue, I mean, if you point out to someone who is genuinely radical about gender issues, in my experience, some of you may disagree from a feminist perspective, but if you say, well, look, the adjusted pay gap is 1 cent on the dollar, and we need to work on, real sexism in the C-suite, but that's not very large. I mean, between black and white men, the gap is 4 cents. Their response would be, well, sure, but you shouldn't be able to adjust because women choose different jobs from men because of sexism. And I actually once spent like 3 days looking at all the research on this and found out that that wasn't true. Like, most of that gap is caused by men picking very high danger jobs that pay pretty well when you have only a high school or junior college degree. But then, like, men are no more naturally aggressive than women. Men are taught to be aggressive by patriarchy because of sexism. So it's just a continual retreat back to the next position. And there, I mean, I think someone like Carrie Smith might actually be useful as recall to programming. Yeah.
Gentleman in the middle of the room with the pale hat. Yes.
The man in the pale hat.
Thanks. Joe Manson, UCLA. Thank you for that talk. Someone, and I can't remember who it was, analyzing Soviet propaganda, said its purpose was not to persuade, it was to humiliate. Everyone knew it was false, but the authorities, by inducing people to say things which they knew to be false, could cause people to feel morally contaminated, and this made it easier to order them around, to rule over them. So do you think anything like that accounts for what you've described?
Probably. I think it's kind of like the difference between the truth teller, the liar, and the bullshitter to some extent. In the famous book BS, like, the truth teller is just saying the thing that's true. The liar will bend ethics sometimes to say a false, convincing thing to gain something. The bullshitter is just saying the best sounding thing, whether it's true or false. I think that many propagandists do not really care. There's a famous study of propagandists. I think this is Siegel and Spaeth, the guys who wrote the attitudinal model. That could easily be wrong. But where they found that as long as people publicly adhere to doctrine, most propagandists don't care whether people actually believe it. Because if you say something enough publicly, you generally, one, you start believing it. And two, it doesn't matter because everyone thinks everyone else believes it. And I'll actually give an example of this. Now, I actually think that the propagandists are wrong about this, because they don't recognize what I'd call sort of the Romanian blue jeans effect. Like, when the Soviet Union, which you're referring to, allowed some free market reforms during the Glasnost and Perestroika era, and this isn't my field of expertise as a political scientist, but my impression is that they crumbled unbelievably quickly, and they crumbled at a pace that none of their economists, some of whom were quite good, predicted. And I think that the fact that no one actually believed the narrative contributed to that. No one wanted to be slightly less communist and buy Bulgarian blue jeans. If you were given the option of more freedom, people preferred the American model and the ruthless competition they had for 10 or 12 years over there, even to the modified alternative. But one example, when I asked the question to the room, I mean, do you believe some women have penises? We don't need to go into the full thing. I actually once asked that on social media. And I was interested in how many people actually believe the narrative. And I do think this is meaningful. This is not a scientific poll. I have an audience on Twitter of about 140,000 people for whatever reason. And I would describe it as kind of a bro group. But it also, like, everybody's feminist girlfriend is in the crowd. Like, when I asked the question, I assumed that there'd be about 30% yes, some women have penises, and 70% no. But in fact, it was 98-2 no. And people started sharing this, including many women, and thousands of people voted, maybe tens of thousands. And as the numbers started coming in, you realize nobody believes this. Like, this is an anonymous poll. We put up a link to SurveyMonkey. Like, none of these people, none of these feminists, none of these businesswomen believe this either. And none of the guys believe it. So you have a baseline of very low adherence to this idea. And I think that when when people are given leeway to disagree with propaganda, the collapse of the propagandistic system is very rapid.
All right, we have like 2.5 minutes left for one question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Really interesting talk. I'm Mike Bernstein at Brown. I know this was sort of a side note, but you mentioned the perceived police shooting data, and that's something that in this kind of crowd gets referenced a lot. I always have a little bit of a hard time with that study because I worry that the response options might be anchoring participants to how they're, I think it's like, do you think it's 10, 100, 1,000, or 10,000? They do something sort of along those lines. And so I never quite know what to make of those results because to me it seems a little bit unclear if that's really what people are perceiving or if that has to do with the way that the response options are listed. So just curious if you have any thoughts there.
No, I think that's a valid methodological point. But I mean, I would say as a methodologist that, you would expect the anchor point, if people were just picking something in the middle, to be maybe 100. I mean, the fact that most people on Very Liberal picked 10,000 or 15% of them did, I think that indicates there's definitely an underlying reality there. That would be my take. Also, Eric Kaufman had that same point, and in his paper, The Social Construction of Racism, he asked a very broad question, I think, specifically to handle that. I don't know if it was for this study, but just do people really know what they're talking about? And it was like, do you think more black men, and another question, young urban men, are killed by police shootings or car wrecks? And it was like half of males said police shootings. I'd have to recheck the paper. But I mean, obviously, like most people killed by car wrecks are young men or 40,000 car. I mean, so people really think some crazy things about that. But that's a good question.
Well, that does it for our panel. Thank you for the questions. Thank you, Professor Reilly.